plane identification. They learn the various types of aircraft just as a man in the Navy. A Navy commander conducts inspection accompanied by a wave officer as his aide. They're training to become instructors in the teaching of gunnery to new men in the service.
Hello, my name is Mel. I'm head of Women's Impressions with the BB-59 Living History crew here at the USS Massachusetts. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the beginning of the waves, which is an impression we just started including here on the ship to get more of the women's perspective during the war. In May of 1941, a representative from Massachusetts, Edith Norse Rogers, put forward this bill to create the WAAC, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and that was ignored until December of that year, 41, when Pearl Harbor happened, and it was clear a lot more manpower was going to be needed. And so the legislation passed in January of 1942 to create a Women's Auxiliary of the Army. However, the trick with the WACs was that they were going to serve with the Army, but not really be a part of it. So the Navy, in around 41, 42, started saying, we like the idea of having this women's group, we really want to bring the women on board, and we could use the help, but we don't like how it's being done with the Army. We want the women to have more of an active role, and that would have given them more flexibility in the jobs, would have meant giving the waves equal pay and benefits. In 1942, the Navy formed the Women's Advisory Council to investigate the best way to incorporate women into the Navy. And the end result of that was the development of the waves in July of 1942. And what made the waves so different from the WACs was that they were considered equal in status to the men's naval reserve. So they had equal pay, they had the same benefits, and they were considered as much on duty as the men who served in the Naval Reserve during this time period. The women in the waves were originally only going to be allowed to serve for the duration of the war plus 6 months. So that way when the war ended, they would have had time to phase them out. So the first commander of the Navy Waves was Mildred McAfee. She was actually the president of Wellesley College, nearby Framingham, Massachusetts, and she was the one who really set the tone for the waves and how they looked. She was the one who made very strict rules about makeup. She was quoted as saying she wanted them to have enough makeup to look human, but not much more than that. So a lot of the waves were explicitly forbidden from wearing too much makeup, and they also had very ladylike conservative uniforms to ensure that parents who are going to send their kids or their daughters into the Navy, that they would be happy with the uniform. There's a lot of bad reputation around women serving, hence some of the bans on makeup and on what the uniform is going to look like. The Navy uniform ended up being designed by a fashion designer at the time named Maine Boucher, and he created the navy blue suit that is most iconic, that you see the waves wearing the most. There are plenty of advertisements from this time that recruit women by saying, you get $200 worth of free clothing. And at a point in America where they were coming out of the Great Depression and they were looking at fabric rationings coming ahead, having a brand new set of clothes was an incredible selling point for the Navy. I've said both Waves and U.S. Naval Reserve. The official title was the Women's U.S. Naval Reserve, but Waves caught on. It stands for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Services, and it was shortened to Waves, which became the most common use. So you can use Women's Naval Reserve and Waves interchangeably, they're the same group. But on a lot of the recruitment posters and in a lot of the literature and documentation from this period, you will see Waves used primarily. So why do we have Waves being represented here in Massachusetts, here in Fall River? So the Waves were actually stationed at 900 different places across the United States. They were not allowed to go overseas, which is saying the wax could hold over the waves. They were allowed to go overseas, and the waves were stationed here in the United States. Some of the more well-known locations that the waves were stationed was Florida. They were in Pensacola and Jacksonville, Florida. They were in Washington, D.C. They were taking on a lot of clerical work and a lot of code-breaking work. Less well-known, there was waves in Colorado, at the University of Colorado in Boulder, learning the Japanese language. There was a language school at the university there. And there were also waves stationed in places like Ohio, where they were in charge of building the computers that ended up cracking the Enigma code. One of the lesser known stations was here in New England. There was a detachment of waves stationed at Camp Endicott in nearby Kingstown, Rhode Island, and there was also waves stationed and training at Holyoke College in Northampton, Mass. So they were training and stationed locally. A big reason we're doing this here is that majority of the women who originally served in the waves were recruited by Mildred McAfee, and they came mostly from the women's colleges in this part of the country. So Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Wellesley College. They were recruiting college-educated women first, so physical sciences, mathematics, language degrees. Those are really the first people recruited by the new commanders of the waves. Developing training for the waves was obviously a bit of a challenge because women were not really anticipated to be willing to go through the same level of rigorous training as the men, and so there was a lot of challenges around developing a training curriculum for the women. Ultimately, they wound up sending most of the enlisted women to Great Lakes, Iowa, at a former teacher's college to go through their basic training, but the officers were trained here in Massachusetts and then at Hunter College in the Bronx. So one of the big questions we do get on board the ship here and when we go to events is, well, what were the waves doing? And what is so interesting about the waves is the way their role evolved throughout the war. There was actually a women's role starting in World War I. The Navy actually started the Naval Nurse Corps in World War I, but they also had a role called the yeomanette. And one of the later commanders of the waves, Joy Bryce Hancock, actually served both in World War I as a yeomanette and in World War II as a commander for the waves. So she served in both the First World War and the Second World War. But in the First World War, waves, or the Navy women, were only allowed to serve as what was called a yeomanette, which is a clerical administrative role, so very secretarial responsibilities. And one of the big misconceptions about the waves is that when they took over for men in World War II, they were taking over a lot of clerical duties. And that may have been true at the very start of the war, but as the conflict dragged out and more men needed to be freed up to go fight in the Pacific and go fight in Europe, they needed to fill those roles with women. So we ended up seeing women in the waves. 1/3 of the waves served in aviation roles, whether that was making planes or overseeing some of the production there. We did have your clerical duties, you had your yeomans, but you also had waves doing everything from Signal Corps. They were doing pigeon messages, actually. They were taking on all kinds of, they were doing weather. They were doing some machinery. They were doing training. So we have a lot of photos of waves teaching the men how to use the firearms and how to use the guns on the ship. Obviously, you had waves that their entire job was leadership. They would have been conducting training. We had the code breakers, and then you had the Naval Nurse Corps, which was completely separate, and they were the ones managing all of the medical responsibilities. And so similar to the waves, a lot of recruiting that we are doing is word of mouth. A lot of women in the 40s either knew one of the professors who got pulled to become leadership, or they heard about it from a friend. And so we're very excited to start getting the stories of the women who served in the Navy. We're really excited to bring this new program to the ship and to the crew. However, we are always looking for women who are interested in joining. We have some very some women that are going to be starting a Naval Nurse Corps group as well. And we look forward to future programs and getting more WAVs and nurses involved with the ship. Our responsibility, especially when we're wearing the uniform of the WAVs, that we get to be the voice for a lot of women who, either due to societal stigmas or security clearances, never spoke about their experiences. So there's very little oral history recorded, and we're doing our best to gather as much of it as possible. But when you come and volunteer with us and represent the WAVs, we are giving a voice and a face to 100,000 women, give or take, who were never really celebrated in their time. And we have that ability to give them a voice and to bring their stories forward. I hope you'll join us. You can find us on Facebook and on the USS Massachusetts.